By the time the refrigerated truck rolled down Whitaker Road, every farmer within 3 miles had already heard what Earl Whitaker had done. It was a gray March morning in southern Missouri, the kind of morning when the sky sat low over the barns and the frost still held in the shaded ditches. The dirt road was soft on top but frozen underneath, and the old fields behind the Whitaker farmhouse looked worse than ever. 80 acres of pale, tired ground stretched toward the creek, crusted hard from years of heavy equipment, hard rains, chemical burn, and summers that seemed to take more from the land than they gave back. Earl Whitaker stood beside the field in a faded canvas jacket, his cap pulled low, his hands buried in his pockets. He was 60 years old, though a man could have added 10 more years just by looking at the way he carried himself. His shoulders bent slightly forward, not from weakness, but from a lifetime of lifting what needed lifting and saying very little about it. The truck stopped beside the leaning gate. The driver stepped out, opened the back doors, and the smell of damp bedding and compost rolled into the cold air. Inside were black plastic tubs stacked in rows. Each one held dark bedding, shredded paper, compost, and thousands of moving earthworms. Not a few bait cups, not a garden experiment. 1 million worms. Across the road, pickup trucks slowed. A pair of brothers who rented land near the creek stopped by the fence. A neighbor in a white Chevy idled at the shoulder with his window cracked open. Someone laughed before Earl had even opened the first tub. Earl heard it. He did not turn around. He carried the first tub to the edge of the field, where he had already dug a shallow trench beneath a strip of old hay. He knelt, lifted a handful of damp bedding, and let the worms slide into the darkness under the mulch. They twisted between his fingers, red and brown and fragile in the cold spring air. He covered them gently with compost, then with straw, then with a layer of leaves he had hauled from the churchyard. From the road, it looked like a desperate old man dumping bait into dead dirt. By noon, the story had reached Miller's Feed and Supply. By supper, it had reached the diner. By the next morning, most of the county agreed that Earl Whitaker had finally lost his mind. The Whitaker farm had not always looked like something waiting to be auctioned. Earl's grandfather had bought the first 40 acres after the war and built the place with a borrowed mule, a 2-room house, and more stubbornness than money. Earl's father added another 40 acres in the 1970s, and for a while, the land carried the family well. Corn filled the bins. Cattle grazed knee-deep grass along the creek. Rain soaked in instead of running off. The garden behind the house was so dark and soft that Earl's mother used to push bean poles into it by hand. But land wears down quietly. A few years of deep plowing become a habit. A few wet springs leave ruts that get worked over instead of healed. A few dry summers make a man push fertilizer harder than the soil can hold. The price of inputs climbs. The machinery gets heavier. The topsoil gets thinner. The living things under the ground disappear so slowly that nobody notices until the field stops answering back. By the time Earl's father died of a heart attack in late October, the Whitaker farm was already in trouble. The old John Deere smoked black and stalled whenever the day got hot. The barn roof leaked in 3 places. The cattle lot stood empty. The pond had shrunk until raccoon tracks crossed the cracked mud where bluegill used to hide. Last year's corn had been thin, uneven, and low enough to make men lower their voices when Earl walked into town. The bank did not lower its voice. The letter came in February, folded clean inside a white envelope with blue printing on the corner. Earl read it at the kitchen table, under the same yellow light where his father used to sharpen pocket knives and sort receipts. The wording was polite, but the meaning was plain. The operating loan was past due. The land had been inspected. The farm's productivity was declining. If Earl could not show a real recovery plan and meaningful income within the next 2 seasons, the bank would begin foreclosure proceedings. 2 seasons. That was all they gave a farm that had taken 3 generations to build. Some neighbors said Earl should sell while he still had a choice. A large agricultural company had been buying land along the county line, and everyone knew they would take Whitaker acres if the bank pushed them loose. Some people said it with sympathy. Others said it while looking at his fields like they were already measuring them. Earl said almost nothing. At night, when the house went quiet and the wind moved the loose porch screen, he opened his father's old notebooks. They were stacked in a drawer beside seed receipts, old rain gauges, soil maps, and yellowed pamphlets from county extension meetings long before Earl had gray in his beard. The pages smelled like dust, coffee, and machine oil. His father's handwriting filled them in square, careful lines. Planting dates, rainfall, crop failures, good years, bad years, worm count good in Westfield after leaf cover, soil opens easy, holds rain. Earl read that note 3 times. The next morning, he walked to the Westfield with a shovel. The blade barely entered. He put his boot on it, leaned his weight, and broke out a chunk of soil that came up hard and gray. It did not crumble in his hand. It snapped apart like old pottery. He dug 5 holes that morning. He found 2 worms. 2 worms in ground that had once grown corn high enough to hide a man. That was when Earl understood that his farm was not just short on fertilizer, it was short on life. The soil had lost its structure. Rain hit the surface and ran away. Roots stayed shallow. Heat baked the top few inches into a crust. Expensive fertilizer passed through the field like money poured through a broken bucket. The field was not merely poor. It was tired. And Earl knew tired things could not be shouted back to strength. They had to be nursed. So he made a decision that looked foolish from the road. He sold 2 old hay wagons, delayed repairing the tractor, used what little credit he still had, and bought earthworms, compost, straw, leaves, and enough irrigation hose to keep small refuge beds damp through the first summer. He did not spread the worms evenly across all 80 acres, as if throwing seed. He knew better than that. He built survival zones first. Along the old fence line, beside the shaded drainage swales, near the barn where water could be hauled. In strips where mulch could keep the soil cool. He dug trenches deep enough to protect the bedding from surface heat, layered them with compost and rotted straw, then covered everything with leaves and old hay. The worms were not asked to rescue 80 acres in 6 months. They were given a place to live, a place to multiply, a place to begin reopening the soil 1 tunnel at a time. That detail did not matter to the men watching from the road. All they saw was an old farmer putting worms into failing land while the bank waited. At Miller's Feed and Supply, men laughed over coffee. They said Earl had bought fishing bait instead of a crop. They said his father would have known better. They said no man could save a farm with worms and notebook ideas. At the diner, someone called the Westfield a worm graveyard, and by the next week, the name had stuck. Even the county agent came out with a clipboard and concern in his eyes. He was not cruel, but he was practical. He told Earl soil rebuilding took time. He told him the bank might not wait long enough. He suggested lime, commercial fertilizer, herbicide, and a clean planting schedule. Earl listened. Then he thanked the man and went back to spreading straw. Spring passed into summer, and nothing dramatic happened. The field did not suddenly turn black. The corn did not jump from the ground. The bank did not change its mind. If anything, Earl's farm looked uglier than before. Strips of mulch lay across the fields like bandages, leaves collected in shallow trenches, compost piles steamed behind the barn, white buckets from the diner sat beside the shed, filled with coffee grounds. Earl hauled old manure from an empty cattle barn south of town and spread it thin. He soaked cardboard from behind the hardware store and laid it under straw in the worst crusted places. People said he was turning a farm into a dump. Earl knew he was feeding the ground. He planted only part of the acreage that first year. That became another reason for ridicule. Every farmer around him planted fence to fence, trying to make up losses with more acres. Earl left wide sections under cover, refusing to run the planter through ground he believed was not ready. He used the rest for a modest crop, enough to bring in some money if the weather held, while the worm beds and mulch strips worked quietly beneath the surface. He kept records with the patience of a man who had stopped expecting anyone to believe him. Soil temperature, moisture depth, worm survival, mulch thickness, root depth, rainfall. Where the worms stayed alive, The soil changed slowly, not all at once, not enough to impress a man driving past at 40 miles an hour. But Earl saw it when he pushed in a knife and found the ground less stubborn. He saw it when water stopped standing in a hard silver sheet after rain and began disappearing into the covered strips. He saw it when he lifted straw and found castings like dark coffee grounds scattered beneath. Then July came hot. The first summer was not the great test, it was the warning. The rain thinned out for weeks. Heat pressed down on the valley. Bare fields cracked first. Earl's uncovered sections suffered like everyone else's. Some of his shallow worm beds failed. He found dry bedding under places where he had not laid enough mulch. Birds tore apart 2 strips near the road. Ants invaded another. He wrote down every loss, because pretending failure had not happened would only make him a fool in a different way. He learned that the worms survived only where the soil stayed shaded and damp. He learned that deep mulch mattered more than hope. He learned that shaded swales, old fence rows, and low pockets near the creek could shelter life when the open field baked. He learned that rebuilding 80 acres would not be a single act of courage. It would be a long argument with heat, debt, weather, and doubt. That first harvest was not a miracle. It was barely enough. Earl sold what corn he could, sold a small amount of worm castings from the beds behind the barn, and made a partial payment to the bank. The banker accepted it without smiling. The farm stayed in Earl's name, but only because the bank believed one more season might recover more money than forcing a sale immediately. In town, nobody apologized. Some said Earl had bought himself a few months and nothing more. Others said the second year would finish him. The agricultural company sent a letter offering to buy the land before foreclosure damaged his credit. Earl folded the letter and placed it under the leg of a wobbly workbench in the barn. That winter, while other men talked at the diner, Earl worked under low clouds and cold rain. He expanded the worm beds. He laid heavier mulch. He planted rye and clover over the resting acres to keep roots in the ground. He repaired the old pond bank enough to hold winter runoff. He shaped shallow contour strips so spring rain would slow instead of tearing across the field. He hauled leaves until his hands cramped. He patched the tractor with used parts and wire. He slept hard and woke before the alarm. There was one night in February when his strength nearly left him. The house was cold except for the kitchen. Bills lay across the table. The bank's second notice sat open beneath the lamp. Rain tapped on the tin roof, steady and indifferent. Earl's boots were still muddy by the door. His back hurt so badly he had trouble straightening after sitting down. For a long time, he looked at the papers without moving. He thought of selling. Not because the neighbors were right, not because he no longer believed in the soil, but because belief did not pay diesel bills, and a man could only ask his body to carry so much. Then he stood, crossed the room, and opened the drawer where his father's notebook lay. He did not read it for comfort this time. He had read it enough. He knew what it said. He took out his own green notebook instead. On the last page, he wrote down what had failed. Shallow beds died. Mulch too thin near road. Need deeper refuge strips. Do not plant weak ground too early. Then he wrote one more line. Keep the living parts alive. That was the turning point. Not a speech. Not a burst of hope. Just a tired man admitting the truth on paper and choosing the next right thing. By the second spring, the field began to show changes even strangers could see. The west strips dried more slowly after wind. The cover crop came up thicker where the worm beds had overwintered. When Earl dug in the shaded swales, he found worms deeper than before, not crowded near the surface, but moving through damp channels below the mulch. The soil was still far from perfect. There were hard patches, weak patches, places that needed another year, but the farm no longer looked dead everywhere. It looked unevenly alive. That was enough for Earl to risk a larger planting. He planted corn across the best recovered sections and left the weakest ground under cover. He did not chase every acre. That drove the town crazy. Men said he was wasting land again. They said no farmer ever paid a bank by leaving acres out of production. Earl let them talk. Then came the drought. It started in late June of the second year and settled over the valley like a lid. Day after day, the sky stayed empty. By mid-July, the grass along the road had turned the color of old rope. Cattle stood in ponds that were shrinking into mud. Corn leaves in the county curled tight by noon. Bare soil cracked open in long, jagged seams. Dust lifted behind every truck and hung in the air after the engines were gone. The drought lasted 60 days. This time, Earl's worms did not survive by magic. Many near the surface died or retreated beyond reach. The open strips were too hot for life to stay shallow. But in the deep mulched beds, in the shaded swales, under rye residue, beneath the leaf-covered contour lines, the soil remained cooler. The channels the worms had made over the past year carried small rains downward when they came. The organic matter held moisture like a sponge. Roots followed the damp paths deeper than they had before. Earl did not have a perfect field. He had a field with places that could endure. That difference saved him. When the bank called him in during the worst of the heat, Earl drove to town with dust trailing behind his old pickup. The banker sat in an office cooled by humming air conditioning and told him the bank could not extend patience again. Earl had 30 days to show that the farm could produce enough income to justify another restructuring. Otherwise, foreclosure would begin in the fall. Earl nodded once. On the drive home, he passed fields that had looked better than his in May and worse than his in August. Corn stood short and gray-green. Leaves rattled in the wind. Irrigated fields held on where water was available, but dryland acres were failing fast. When he reached his own gate, he stopped the truck and walked. The Whitaker corn was not the tallest in the county. It was not pretty enough for a seed catalog. The outer rows near the road had suffered badly, and the hilltop patch showed stress like every other farm. But the west field, the contour strips, and the acres nearest the swales were still holding color, not bright spring green, a deeper, stubborn green, the color of plants that had found water somewhere below the panic. Earl pushed his shovel into the soil near a mulched row. The blade went in. That alone would have made his father look twice. He turned the soil and saw the difference. The top was dry, but beneath it, the ground broke into crumbs instead of plates. Fine roots threaded downward. Old straw had become dark matter. Worm channels ran through the profile like tiny wells. A few worms curled deep in the damp layer, far below where the July heat had burned the surface. Earl stood there with both hands on the shovel handle. For once, he did not think about the laughter. He thought about water moving down instead of away. By late August, the county agent returned. This time he did not start with advice. He walked into the field, knelt, and dug with a soil knife. He examined the residue, the roots, the channels, the castings, the difference between bare ground and covered ground. His shirt darkened with sweat. Dust stuck to his neck. When he finally stood, he looked across the field toward the road where 2 trucks had slowed to watch. He did not say Earl had performed a miracle. He said the soil had structure again. That word traveled through town more quietly than the jokes had, but it traveled. Structure. Farmers understood that word. They understood what it meant in a dry year. They understood that Earl had not beaten the drought. He had given his land enough life and cover to take the hit without breaking. Harvest came in October, under a copper-colored sky. Earl climbed onto the combine before sunrise, the old machine coughing smoke as if it resented being asked for one more season. The first rows were thin, and his stomach tightened. Then the machine moved into the west field. Grain began to pour. Not like a fairy tale, not like a field untouched by hardship, but steady, better than the neighbors expected, better than the bank expected, better than Earl had allowed himself to hope. By the end of harvest, the numbers were plain. The Whitaker farm had produced its best dryland corn yield in more than 12 years on the recovered acres. The weakest ground still lagged behind, but the living strips carried the season. The corn check, combined with sales of worm castings, compost, and starter beds to gardeners and small farms, gave Earl enough to make the payment the bank had demanded. The 80 acres stayed Whitaker land. The banker came out after the harvest. He arrived in polished shoes that were wrong for the field and stood at the edge of the West acres while Earl dug 2 holes. From the first, near the old road where the ground had not yet recovered fully, Earl lifted pale, tight soil that broke in hard chunks. From the second, beneath the covered strip, he lifted dark, crumbly earth that held roots, castings, old straw, and the faint movement of worms turning away from the light. Earl placed both samples in the banker's hands. The banker looked down at them. One hand held what the farm had been. The other held what it was becoming. For a long moment, nobody spoke. A truck passed slowly on the road, but this time no one laughed from the window. That silence did more than any apology could have done. In January, the county agent asked Earl to attend the winter soil meeting at the Grange Hall. Earl refused to give a speech, but he agreed to bring something. On the night of the meeting, the hall smelled of coffee, wet coats, and floor wax. Farmers filled the folding chairs, some curious, some uncomfortable, some pretending they had never called his field a worm graveyard. Earl walked in wearing his old jacket and carrying 2 5-gallon buckets. He did not stand behind the podium. He set the buckets on a table under the fluorescent lights. From the first bucket, he poured a slab of pale, compacted soil onto a metal tray. It hit with a dull, heavy sound and stayed in hard pieces. From the second, he poured dark earth from the west field. It fell apart softly, scattering into crumbs. Fine roots held parts of it together. A few worms twisted in the dampness before disappearing beneath the clods. The room went quiet. The county agent brought over 2 clear jars of water. Earl took a hard chunk from the first tray and dropped it in. The water clouded almost immediately as the soil slaked apart, collapsing into gray sediment. Then he took a crumb from the second tray and dropped it into the other jar. It held its shape longer. Air bubbles rose slowly from inside it. The water stayed clearer. Men leaned forward. No speech could have done what those 2 jars did. The banker stood at the back of the room with his hat in his hands. The brothers who had laughed by the fence stared at the table. One older farmer reached into the dark soil and let it fall through his fingers. He did not look at Earl when he asked how deep the mulch had been. Another asked how long the worms had needed to establish. A third wanted to know how Earl kept them alive through July. Earl answered quietly. He told them it had taken 2 seasons, not 1. He told them some worms had died. He told them shade mattered, mulch mattered, roots mattered, water movement mattered. He told them the worms had not saved the farm alone. They had been part of a living system the farm had been missing for years. He did not say, "I told you so." He did not need to. The proof was breathing in the bucket. That spring, pickup trucks began turning into Earl's driveway for a different reason. Men came for worm castings, for old rye seed, for advice on mulch, for help reading a field after rain. Earl never made them feel small for asking. He remembered too clearly how it felt to stand alone at the fence with everyone watching. The farm did not become rich overnight. The barn still needed work. The tractor still smoked. Some acres still had a long road back. But the bank stopped calling with threats. The soil kept darkening. The pond held water longer. The west field no longer crusted after every rain. And each year, Earl wrote more notes in his green notebook. One evening after a soft April rain, Earl walked to the edge of the field where the refrigerated truck had stopped 2 years earlier. The sun was low behind the trees. Water stood in the road ditches, but not in sheets across his field. It had gone down, into root channels, into worm tunnels, into soil that had learned to open again. Earl knelt and lifted a handful of earth. It was cool. It was dark. It moved. He held it for a moment, then let it fall back through his fingers. Inside the farmhouse, his father's notebook lay in the kitchen drawer beside his own. One carried the memory of what the land had been. The other carried the record of how it had been brought back. Earl turned toward the house as the last light caught the wet straw between the rows. Behind him, under 80 acres that the bank had called finished, Millions of small lives kept working in the dark. No applause, no argument, no miracle. Just the old farm breathing again.